Hey guys, Mike here from Binya Outdoors. I want to talk to you today about what I call my default loadout. So this episode is gonna kind of apply to more the guys who have multiple rods. If you've ever seen a bass boat at the boat ramp or ever wondered why guys carry 10 rods on the deck of their bass boat or why kayak guys have so many rods on the back of their boat, the reason for that is because it allows us to not have to sit here and do like I'm doing on the water. It allows us to preset a bunch of different types of baits ahead of time so that we don't have to constantly spend our entire day on the water retying. When we come upon a situation, we're able to fish it. So I have what I call a default loadout, and it's not something that I keep necessarily the whole day, but it's something that I start with, and it might give you some ideas on how to prep yourself for fishing. So the first loadout that I do is I usually do some sort of bait caster with a belly weighted swim bait. This is a little bit bigger size. It's a Jackal Rhythm Wave. It's a little bit bigger paddle tail. It's got a little bit more action. I'm in July, so I'm needing a little bit of an upsized bite to try to entice some of these fish. So the reason why I use that specific bait is because it allows me to fish everywhere. I can fish it in deeper water as a shallow kind of skimming bait. I can fish it in heavy cover, and it allows me to ultimately cover a lot of water and be able to be really finessey. Now the next bait, and forgive me guys, I am tying because I'm about to go fishing, but kind of wanted to get this topic on video. So the next bait that I usually use is something that's also in the same vein as the swim bait, but it's a little bit bigger profile. So typically I will run a swim jig. For those of you not familiar with a swim jig, this right here is a swim jig. This is a Gambler swim jig with a white trailer. Now, I don't actually normally fish white, just to kind of mention that color, but this particular body of water, for some reason, white works here. I've had success with it, so it's actually one of the few places that I bust out that white. And that kind of brings me to color selection. When you're starting out, be very basic. Match the hatch, use your green pumpkins, your black and blues. You can always swap out colors later on once you figure out what they want. The purpose of this is not to figure out exactly what baits you're going to catch on all day. This is to give you a variety of baits to allow you to have the ability to determine the pattern and then adjust as needed. So the second bait, like I said, is a swim jig. The reason why I do a swim jig, this allows me to fish a little bit deeper, but also I use a swim jig a lot of times like a regular jig. I will throw a 1/2 ounce swim jig, but then if I need a situation where I need to just throw a jig, maybe it's a grass edge, maybe it's a ledge, something like that, I will still throw this like a regular jig, let it fall, pop it a couple of times, swim it back. So it gives me kind of a dual purpose. Now in this situation today, I'll probably be using a regular jig as well, but this just gives me a second color jig, something with a skirt, that allows me to keep fishing without having to, again, change baits. Now, again, if you don't have multiple rods, this is going to be a video that doesn't really apply to you, but this is just another tool to be able to fish a different situation. I get into heavy grass, I get into thick cover, I'm going to be able to throw this thing up in there with straight braid. I run mine with straight braid most of the time, and that will allow me to fish that style. Now, if I go a little bit deeper, I want to say I get a little bit further into the water column. Maybe I've got submergent grass. I'm not in super shallow, but I want a little bit more. I want a little bit of kick. That's when I bust out the chatterbait. Now, I know you're thinking, well, chatterbait and a swim jig are kind of the same thing. They kind of are, and I agree with you 100% on that, but there is something about the chatterbait that draws fish that a swim jig won't, that a paddle tail won't. So it's still in that same vein as a swim jig. It's still in that same kind of concept. But what it does is it allows you to have a little bit of vibration, a little bit of drawing power. One thing I do with mine, which is a little bit funky, I don't necessarily always tie straight braid. I do a lot, but I always tie a snap when I use a chatterbait. And the reason for that is I feel like, and it could just be completely me, but I feel like when you use a snap with a chatterbait, it creates a different action. It has a lot more ability for that blade to flop back and forth. So I run straight braid to a snap to my chatterbait. Now, when we're talking about open water, maybe I find an area on the water that has some rocky bottom, or maybe I just get enough open water, maybe 8-10 feet of water where I want to fish something else. I throw on a square bill. Now I tie this with a little mono leader, like just a few inches. It acts as a shock absorber for those treble hooks. If you try to set with a treble hook and you have straight 40-pound braid, there's a good chance you're going to bend those hooks out on the fight back. So I always tie like a little shock absorber mono, sometimes from my finger to my elbow, just to give me a little bit of a cushion between that. But I run a square bill for grinding bottom, for fishing over top of vegetation, because that square bill blade will come through there. It'll knock that stuff out of the way. And it's just a good kind of medium size, got a good profile. This is actually an A-Bay Lure Lab paint job on this one. It's just something that it helps to cover a different type of bite to see if they want something like this. When we get deeper, I go to the lipless. I don't like deep diving baits. It's not my thing. This one right here is a Berkeley War Pig. I think it's literally called bluegill. But I like a 1/2 ounce or heavier lipless crankbait, because I can take that, I can cast it out deep, I can yo-yo it, I can take it, cast it, let it sink, reel it slow back, or I can burn it across the top of the grass. So it's versatile, but it allows me to get a little bit deeper than this square bill that only dives to about 6 feet. Now the last bait is something that I don't always do, and it's something that I've just kind of started to experiment with. I will go big. So I will actually bust out a Megabass Mag Draft. Or if it's not something as big as this, sometimes I will go with something like, for example, I will go with a bigger swim bait. On a regular swim bait head, I'll throw like a 5-inch swim bait without a skirt. So basically your swim jig profile. It's just in case they want the bigger bait, but something about that skirt doesn't entice them. Today we're throwing the Mag Draft because where I'm fishing has a lot of pike, and I want to try to see if I can get into a big pike. But that's my basic loadout. I usually run all of those rods. That way I can cover shallow, I can cover deep, I can cover grass. I have a little bit of noise with the rattles from those liplesses, and that's what I start with, and that allows me to then get through the rest of the day figuring things out. Now I will throw in, I do recommend during certain times of the year running maybe a football jig or a flipping jig into that mix, because there is certain situations where that will help. The last bait that I always have, is I have a spinning rod tied up with a wacky rig or a Ned rig, or I sometimes put a snap on my spinning rod and I run both depending on what they want. And that is my basic setup. It covers all the different areas. You can change the baits out as you go, but that gives you, if you keep in the same categories, it actually makes it easier. So for example, if my swim jig is not working, I change it from white to black and blue. My chatterbait isn't working, maybe I change it from a black darker color to a green pumpkin, or even a white. My crankbait's not working, I go with a bluegill pattern, maybe I switch it to a perch pattern. You're kind of seeing the point. I keep the same category on the same rod. I know it's very specific and niche down, but ultimately it helps you to just look at that rod and go, okay, that lipless isn't working, let's try changing a different color, different style. And that way you're just changing one type of bait, which is already set up on the rod that you have, and you just keep changing them out till you figure that pattern out and you start catching fish. So I hope that information helps you guys, hopes to get you thinking. Maybe it'll give you some ideas on how to set up your rods for the next time you go fishing. If you haven't already, hit that like, hit that subscribe, and as always, let's get out there, catch more fish.